The Church of the Holy Atonement towered over the neighborhoods of Atlanta's South Side like a beacon of hope amidst a sea of ordinary life. Every Sunday morning, its doors opened welcomingly to admit parishioners seeking spiritual solace. On this sunny Sunday in July, the crowd was especially large. The worshippers, dressed in their finest attire, took their seats on the wooden pews, chatting softly as they waited for the service. When the clock struck 10, the side door opened, and the Reverend Leroy Washington entered the hall. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a carefully trimmed beard and shrewd dark eyes, he exuded that special charisma that set him apart from the other pastors in town. His dark blue suit fit him impeccably, the gold cross on the chain gleaming in the light streaming in through the stained glass windows. "Good morning, brothers and sisters." His deep velvet voice filled the space of the church, and the congregation fell instantly silent. Today we're going to talk about faithfulness to the Lord, faithfulness to our promises, faithfulness to one another. Reverend Leroy was a master of words. His sermons were always passionate and compelling, causing even the most skeptical of listeners to reflect on their lives and actions. During his 10 years of ministry in this church, he gained a reputation not only as an excellent speaker, but also as a wise counselor to whom people came with their problems. "Amen!" resounded from different corners of the hall when he emphasized important points in his sermon in a particularly emotional way. In the first pew, as always, sat his wife, Imani Washington, a woman of 43 with an elegant posture and a calm, almost serene face. Her dark skin contrasted with her cream-colored dress, and her hair was gathered into a neat bundle. She listened attentively to her husband, nodding approvingly from time to time. For the congregation, they were the perfect couple, the pastor and his faithful companion, a model of Christian marriage and family values. After the service, as usual, Reverend Leroy stood at the door, bidding farewell to the congregation. Imani was by his side, exchanging greetings with the women of the congregation, accepting invitations to tea and compliments on another successful sermon by her husband. "Sister Imani, you should be proud of the Reverend," said an elderly Mrs. Johnson, shaking her hand. "Such a heartfelt sermon on faithfulness I haven't heard in years." Imani smiled, but her eyes remained serious. "Yes, my husband has a way with words, Mrs. Johnson." As the last parishioners left the church, Imani approached Leroy, who was discussing something with Deacon Octavius Freeman, a stout man of 52, with a streak of gray in his short-cropped hair. "I'm going home to make dinner," she said. "You remember Zora's coming over today?" Leroy frowned for a moment, as if he'd actually forgotten about it, but quickly smiled. "Of course, darling. I'll be home in an hour and a half tops. Just need to discuss a few organizational matters with Octavius." Deacon Octavius, who had been watching this brief exchange of remarks, noticed a slight shadow running across Imani's face. He had known this family for years and was perceptive enough to see what lurked behind the facade of a perfect marriage: tension, the unspoken, perhaps even pain. The Washingtons' home was located in a respectable neighborhood, a 15-minute drive from the church. 2 stories high, with a manicured garden and a spacious veranda, it matched the status of its owners. Imani walked slowly up the steps, unlocked the door, and entered the cool lobby. Here, away from prying eyes, she allowed her face to take on a more natural expression, tired and a little sad. She passed into the kitchen and began to prepare dinner. Her movements were mechanical, brought to automaticity by years of repetition. Her thoughts were far away. She was thinking about her little sister, whom she hadn't seen in almost a year. Zora had gone off to college in another state, and their communication was limited to phone calls and occasional video chats. Zora was the complete opposite of her older sister, bright, impulsive, free of convention. At 21, she had already changed several majors in college, modeled, and even had a small part in an independent film. Imani sometimes envied her freedom, but she never admitted it even to herself. The sound of a car pulling up interrupted her musings. Too soon for Leroy, then. "Imani, are you home?" Zora's ringing voice echoed through the house before she could even open the door. "In the kitchen," Imani replied, quickly wiping her hands on her apron. The next moment, Zora appeared on the kitchen doorstep, slender, with short-cropped hair dyed a bright burgundy color, wearing jeans and a loose blouse. The sisters hugged, and Imani smelled the familiar scent of exotic perfume. "You look amazing, big sis," Zora said, pulling away and looking over Imani. "This house is still just as spotless, and you're just as spotless. Nothing changes, does it?" Imani caught the slight irony in her words, but chose to ignore it. "You look beautiful too, Zora. Only that hair. What will the Reverend say?" Zora laughed, shaking the brightly colored strands. "Oh, I'm sure Leroy will find an apt quote from the Bible about the diversity of God's creations or something. He's always been a master at finding the right words." Imani hummed indefinitely and went back to preparing dinner. "Help me set the table. Leroy should be back soon." They worked side by side, exchanging news. Zora talked about college, new friends, future plans, and Imani mostly listened, inserting short comments. When the table was set and all the dishes were ready, the front door opened again. "I'm home!" Leroy's voice boomed through the house, and a moment later he appeared on the doorstep of the kitchen. His gaze first stopped on Imani, then shifted to Zora, and for a split second something flashed in it that made Imani inwardly tense up. Surprise? Admiration? She couldn't pinpoint it, but it was something she hadn't seen in her husband's eyes when he looked at her. "Zora, what a surprise!" Leroy smiled widely, opening his arms. "What kind of surprise is it, Leroy?" Son-in-law asked with mild bewilderment as she hugged her son-in-law. "Imani says you knew I was coming today." Of course, Leroy quickly corrected himself. "What I meant was that I'm surprised at how much you've changed. That hair. They're certainly expressive." Zora laughed, and Leroy continued to look at her with a smile that Imani thought lasted a little longer than it should have. She pushed the thought away. "Let's have lunch before things get cold." At lunch, Leroy was in his element, telling stories of parish life, joking, inquiring about Zora's affairs. He was charming and attentive, just the way the parishioners knew him. But Imani noticed how often his gaze lingered on Zora, how he leaned forward slightly when she spoke, how he laughed at her jokes a little louder than they deserved. "How long do you plan on staying with us, Zora?" Leroy asked as lunch was coming to an end. "A couple weeks, if you don't mind," Zora replied. "I'm on vacation until the end of the month, and then I'll need to get back to classes." "You're always welcome," Imani said, starting to clear the table. "Your room is always ready." "Great!" Leroy stood up from the table, blotting his lips with a napkin. "I have more work to do on the sermon for next Sunday. I'll see you at dinner." He left the room, and Imani noticed Zora's gaze following him. Something in that look made her vaguely uneasy, but she brushed the feeling away again. "It's just fatigue," she told herself. The next few days passed in a relatively calm atmosphere. Zora quickly settled into the house, though she spent most of her time exploring the city or reading in the garden. Leroy was busy with church affairs, while Imani was busy with household chores and working on the church's charity committee. Gradually, however, Imani began to notice changes in her husband's behavior. He lingered at home more often, especially when Zora was there, finding reasons to make conversation with her, offering to show her the sights of the city. And one evening, walking past the living room, Imani saw Leroy sitting next to Zora on the couch, showing her something in a book, their heads almost touching. She froze in the doorway watching this scene and suddenly felt a sharp prick of jealousy. But immediately, she was ashamed of the feeling. "This is Leroy," she said to herself. "My husband, a pastor, a man who has devoted his life to God. And Zora is my sister. I shouldn't even think of such a thing." But the thought, once raised, did not want to go away. It haunted Imani as she went to bed beside her husband, who now seemed strangely distant, as she prepared breakfast and heard Zora and Leroy talking animatedly in the garden. On Sunday, Imani sat in the first pew during the service as usual, but her thoughts were far from the sermon. She didn't notice the strange man sitting next to her until he addressed her after the service was over. "Mrs. Washington?" His voice was quiet but confident. "My name is Malik Brooks. I'm a detective." Imani looked at him in surprise. A man of about 38, with an attentive gaze and a calm expression, he was dressed in a modest but elegant suit. "What can I do for you, Detective Brooks?" she asked, trying to hide her concern. "Nothing urgent," he smiled. I recently moved to the neighborhood and was looking for a church. Heard good things about your husband's sermons. They are not exaggerated, I must say. Imani smiled politely, but inwardly tensed. Something in the detective's manner made her feel that he was watching her more closely than he should in a casual acquaintance. "I hope you'll become a regular parishioner, detective," she said, standing up. "Quite possibly," he nodded. "Have a good day, Mrs. Washington." As Imani stepped back, Deacon Octavius approached her. His usually calm face expressed concern. "Sister Imani, may I speak to you privately?" he asked, looking around. "Of course, Brother Octavius." Imani followed him into the small meeting room of the church council. Octavius closed the door behind them and was silent for a while, as if choosing his words. "Sister Imani, I don't know how to begin this conversation," he finally said. "But I feel I must tell you. I have noticed some changes in Reverend Leroy's behavior lately." Imani felt her heart begin to beat faster. "What changes, Brother Octavius?" The deacon looked extremely uncomfortable. "He has become absent-minded at council meetings, sometimes answering inappropriately, and I have seen—" He hesitated. "I have seen the way he looks at your sister. That's not the way a pastor should look at a young parishioner." Imani froze, her worst fears taking shape in Octavius's words. "I could be wrong," the deacon added hastily, "and I don't want to cause discord in your family, but you deserve to know if something is going on." "Thank you, Brother Octavius," Imani said quietly. "Yeah, I will consider your words. Consider your—" She left the room with a heavy heart. On her way out of the church, she saw Detective Malik again, talking to someone in the congregation. He caught her eye and nodded slightly. At that moment, Imani felt a strange sense of foreboding, as if fate had brought them together for a reason. Tuesday morning began as usual for Imani, with the preparation of breakfast for the family. She was standing at the stove, mechanically flipping pancakes, when she heard Zora laughing from the garden. Looking out the window, Imani saw her sister sitting on a garden bench with a cup of coffee. A moment later, she was joined by Leroy, dressed in a tracksuit after his morning jog. He sat down next to Zora, too close, it seemed to Imani, and said something, causing her to burst out laughing again. Imani turned away from the window, feeling the anxiety building up inside. She had noticed more and more of these moments over the past few days. Casual touches, long stares, quiet conversations that stopped when she appeared. Each time she convinced herself that it was just her imagination, that she was seeing something that wasn't there. But the words of Deacon Octavius kept her still. "Breakfast is ready!" she shouted, setting the plates on the table. Leroy and Zora entered the kitchen, still laughing at some joke. "What are you guys so excited about this early in the morning?" Imani asked, trying to keep her voice sounding casual. "Oh, nothing in particular," Leroy replied, sitting down at the table. "Zora was telling me a funny story about her literature professor." "Yeah, can you imagine he decided to give a lecture in the character of Edgar Allan Poe?" Zora picked up on the story as she piled on her pancakes. "With a false beard and everything. It was really funny." Imani smiled, but the smile didn't touch her eyes. "Sounds really funny." Breakfast passed in a strange atmosphere, with Leroy and Zora chatting animatedly, and Imani mostly silent as she watched them. She noticed the way Leroy touched Zora's hand lightly as he passed her the syrup for the pancakes, the way his gaze lingered on her longer than it should have. These small details that she might have ignored before were now adding up to a disturbing picture. After breakfast, Leroy announced that he had to go to church. Some pressing business demanded his attention. "Don't expect me for lunch," he said, kissing Imani on the cheek. "I may be late." When the door closed behind him, Imani turned to Zora, who was helping clear the table. "Do you have any plans for today?" she asked as casually as possible. Zora shrugged her shoulders. "Nothing in particular. Thought maybe go to the mall, see some new movies." "That sounds great. I'd keep you company, but I have a meeting with the charity committee." Imani lied, though she didn't actually have any meeting. Shortly after Zora left, Imani got into her car and headed towards the church. She herself didn't know what she hoped to find there, but an inner voice told her that she should check to see if Leroy was really there. As she pulled up to the church, she saw her husband's car in the parking lot, and that calmed her down a bit. Imani decided not to go inside so as not to disturb Leroy and was about to drive away when she noticed a familiar figure. Deacon Octavius came out of the side door of the church and headed for his car. Imani rolled down her window and waved to him. Octavius noticed her and walked over. "Sister Imani, didn't expect to see you here," he said as he leaned out the car window. "Just passing through," she replied. "Is Leroy busy right now?" Octavius's face changed. There was something akin to confusion in it. "Reverend Leroy? I thought he was working from home today. He's not at church." Imani felt her heart skip a beat. "But his car is in the parking lot." Octavius turned around and looked at the parking lot. "Really? Strange. I've been at the church all morning and haven't seen him." "Perhaps he's in his office," Imani suggested, even though she already knew it was unlikely. "I just came from there." Octavius shook his head. "There's no one there." They both fell silent, and an awkward tension hung in the air. "Sister Imani," Octavius finally spoke up, "I don't mean to cause you concern, but after our conversation on Sunday, I noticed something else. I left my glasses in church last night and went back to get them. It was late, about 10 o'clock, and I saw Reverend Leroy with your sister. They were in his office, and, their conversation seemed very personal." Imani felt her breath catch. "What do you mean?" Octavius looked very uncomfortable. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the door was ajar. They were talking about feelings. Reverend Leroy said something like he couldn't stop thinking about her. I left as soon as I heard that, didn't want to get involved." Imani sat motionless, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She could feel the cold rage building up inside, mixed with pain and disbelief. "Thank you for telling me, Brother Octavius." Her voice sounded strangely calm. "I will deal with it." The deacon looked concerned. "Sister Imani, please be careful. I may have misunderstood everything. Don't jump to conclusions." Imani nodded, but her thoughts were already far away. She started the car and drove slowly out of the parking lot, not noticing the worried look Octavius was giving her. Instead of driving home, Imani parked on a nearby street that overlooked the church parking lot. She decided to wait for Leroy to come out of the church and follow him. Part of her still hoped that this was some kind of misunderstanding, that there was a simple and innocent explanation for all of this. It was about an hour before Imani saw Leroy leave the church. He quickly got into his car and drove out of the parking lot. Imani waited a few seconds and followed, trying to stay far enough away so he wouldn't notice her. To her surprise, Leroy wasn't heading home or to the mall, but toward the city park. He parked at the north entrance, got out of the car, and headed deep into the park. Imani stopped a little farther away and followed him, trying to stay in the shade of the trees. The park was relatively empty on this weekday. Leroy walked along the winding path, occasionally stopping and looking around as if waiting for someone. Finally, he came to a small clearing with benches surrounded by tall trees. There, on one of the benches, sat Zora. Imani froze behind the trunk of a large oak tree, watching her husband approach her sister. Zora stood up to meet him, and they embraced, not the way relatives embrace, but a tight, intimate hug. Then Leroy took Zora's face in his hands and kissed her, a long, passionate kiss. Imani felt the ground go from under her feet. All her worst fears were confirmed. Her husband, her pastor, the man she'd trusted all her life, and her own sister had betrayed her in the most brutal way. She didn't remember walking back to her car. She didn't remember driving home. All the while, her mind had been spinning with scraps of thoughts, memories, suspicions that now made sense. Small signs of attention, strange phone calls, inexplicable absences, all of it added up to a clear picture of betrayal. Entering the house, Imani mechanically walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Her hands trembled slightly. She sat down at the table and waited. Part of her wanted to scream, to beat the dishes, to vent all the pain and rage that boiled up inside. But the other part, the stronger part, decided to wait for Leroy and Zora to return, to hear what they had to say, how they would try to explain their actions. Several hours passed. The sun was already slipping toward dusk when Imani heard the sound of the front door opening. Leroy and Zora's voices sounded muffled, but she could distinguish laughter and whispers. They hadn't expected to catch her at home. "Imani?" Leroy called out, entering the kitchen. "I thought you had a meeting with the committee today." Imani slowly raised her head and looked at her husband. Her gaze was calm, but there was such pain in it that Leroy involuntarily took a step back. "The meeting was canceled," she said quietly. "Where have you been?" Zora appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face changing when she saw the look on her sister's face. We were at the mall," Leroy began. "I met Zora by chance and—" "Don't lie to me," Imani interrupted him, her voice icy. "I saw you in the park. I saw everything." A heavy silence hung in the room. Leroy and Zora exchanged quick glances, and Imani could see the panic in them. "Imani, let me explain," Leroy finally said, taking a step toward her. "It's not what you think." "What am I supposed to think, Leroy?" Imani asked, standing up. "That my husband, the pastor, the man who preaches about faithfulness and honesty every Sunday, is hugging and kissing my little sister. How do you explain that?" Zora came forward, her face pale. "Imani, I'm so sorry. We didn't want you to find out this way." "So you didn't want me to find out at all?" Imani turned to her sister, her voice shaking with restrained rage. "You came to my house, ate at my table, slept under my roof, all the while planning to steal my husband?" "No one planned anything," Leroy interjected. "It just happened. We couldn't resist those feelings." "Feelings?" Imani grinned bitterly. "What kind of deep feelings can you develop in a week, Leroy? Or did it start earlier? Have you been communicating behind my back?" Leroy and Zora exchanged glances again, and Imani realized she had hit the mark. "How long has this been going on?" she asked, feeling everything go cold inside. "A few months," Zora answered quietly. "We met when I was visiting for Christmas, remember? Then we started texting, calling each other. And you let me invite her to visit knowing you were having an affair?" Imani turned to Leroy, her eyes burning with anger and tears. "How could you do this to me?" Leroy sighed and ran a hand over his face. "Imani, our marriage is not what it used to be. You know that. We live as neighbors instead of husband and wife. With Zora, I feel alive again." "And that justifies betrayal?" Imani shook her head. "You could have told me you were unhappy. We could have talked, tried to change things, or part with dignity, but you chose lies and deceit." "I was afraid," Leroy admitted. "Afraid of scandal, afraid the congregation would turn on me if they knew I wanted a divorce. The reputation of the church, my reputation." "Your reputation?" Imani laughed, but there was no mirth in her laughter. "You slept with your wife's sister, Leroy. What reputation are you talking about?" Leroy's face suddenly changed, his ostensible contrition replaced by irritation. "Don't pretend to be so innocent, Imani. You knew our marriage had been dying for years, but you were fine with it as long as you could play the part of the pastor's perfect wife." "I loved you," Imani said quietly. "Even when you grew cold and aloof, even when you stopped noticing me. I still loved you and believed we could overcome the difficulties." "You loved the idea of marrying a pastor," Leroy parried, his voice growing louder. "You loved the status, the respect you got from the congregation. But you never loved me, the real me." Imani looked at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. "Who are you? I thought I knew you, but now I realize I've been living with a stranger all these years." "Imani, please," Zora intervened. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We were going to tell you when we found the right moment." "The right moment?" Imani turned to her sister. "When would it come? After you've enjoyed another couple weeks of deception under my roof?" Zora lowered her eyes, unable to find the words to answer. "And now what?" Imani asked, shifting her gaze from her sister to her husband. "What is your plan? Will you leave together? Start a new life?" Leroy straightened up as if making an important decision. "Yes, that's exactly right. I'm going to file for divorce, Imani. Zora and I love each other and we want to be together." Those words hit Imani harder than she expected. It was one thing to find out about the affair and quite another to hear that her husband was going to leave her for his own sister. "You can't stay on as pastor if this gets out," she said. "Do you realize that?" "I'll find another church," Leroy shrugged. "Or I'll do something else. It doesn't matter." "Doesn't matter?" Imani couldn't believe her ears. "Your calling, your flock, all these people who believe in you, they don't matter." "They do matter," Leroy replied. But I can't live a lie anymore. I can't preach about honesty and faithfulness when I don't follow those principles myself. But you may have cheated on your wife with her sister, Imani remarked bitterly. That wasn't a problem for your conscience. Leroy sighed. I know what I did was wrong. I apologize for the pain I caused you, but I can't change the way I feel. Feelings, Imani repeated. Always those feelings. What about commitments, Leroy? What about the vows we made to each other before God? People change, Imani, Leroy said. Feelings change. We can't control that. But we can control our actions, Imani objected. You could have stopped. You could have talked to me before you betrayed me like that. A heavy silence hung in the room. Imani stood leaning on the kitchen table, her gaze fixed on the space between her husband and sister. I think you should leave, she finally said. Both of you. Right now. Imani, we can't just leave like this, Leroy objected. We have practical matters to discuss. The house, the finances, the church. Not now, Imani interrupted him. I can't. I don't want to see you now. Please leave. Zora took a step toward her sister. Imani, I know you hate me right now, and you have a right to, but I hope that one day you can forgive me. Imani looked at her sister with an expression that was a mixture of hurt and anger. Go away, Zora. Just go. Zora nodded and headed for the exit. Leroy remained standing still, looking at Imani with an expression she couldn't decipher. I'll get my things and spend the night at the motel, he said. We'll talk more calmly tomorrow. No, Imani shook her head. I don't want you to go upstairs. I'll gather your things and leave them by the front door. Come get them tomorrow when I'm not home. Leroy wanted to object, but something in the expression on Imani's face stopped him. He nodded and turned to leave, but stopped at the last moment. I never meant to hurt you, Imani, he said quietly. I hope you'll realize that someday. Imani didn't answer. She just stood motionless, watching her husband walk out of the kitchen. She heard the front door slam, the engine of his car start. The sound gradually faded into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to cry. Tears streamed down her face as she sank into a chair, feeling her whole life crumble around her. Everything she believed in, everything she thought was real and solid, was proving to be an illusion. Imani didn't know how much time had passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. She was sitting in the semi-darkness of the kitchen, immersed in her thoughts, when she heard the sound of the door opening. Her heart sank. Imani? Leroy's voice echoed through the empty house. He walked into the kitchen and she saw that his face had changed. The expression of fake remorse was gone. Now it expressed irritation and impatience. I went back for my phone, he said. I think I left it here. Imani silently pointed to the phone lying on the edge of the table. Leroy picked it up and was about to leave when she spoke. Did you ever love me? She asked quietly. Leroy stopped and turned to her. Of course I loved you. When we were married, I was sincere in my feelings. And then? He shrugged. Then, life became routine. You became a chore. I felt trapped, Imani. Trapped in a marriage that no longer brought me joy, trapped in the role I was supposed to play. And instead of talking to me, you began to seek solace on the side? There was no accusation in her voice, only weariness. You're not the first, Imani, Leroy said suddenly, and his words fell like stones. Zora is not the first. There have been others. Imani felt something shiver inside. What? You heard? Leroy looked at her almost defiantly. There were other women. Not many, only 3 or 4 over the years, but there have been. 3 or 4, Imani echoed. And you've been preaching about loyalty and honesty all this time. I'm human, Imani. A note of irritation appeared in Leroy's voice. I've made mistakes, but with Zora it's different. With her, I feel something I haven't felt in years. And that's why you decided to ruin my life? Imani stood up, her hands clenched into fists. You ruined everything, Leroy. Not just our marriage, but my relationship with my sister, my faith in people, in the church, in everything I thought was important. Don't be dramatic, Imani, Leroy grumbled. You're a strong woman. You'll get through a divorce. A lot of people go through it. This isn't about divorce. Imani shook her head. It's about betrayal. The lies. in everything you've done all these years behind my back." Leroy sighed with the look of a man bored with this conversation. "I'm not going to stand here all night and listen to accusations. I'm here for my phone and I'm leaving." He turned to leave, and that's when Imani saw the knife on the cutting board, the large kitchen knife she used to cut vegetables for dinner that no one had eaten. She didn't remember taking it in her hand. She didn't remember stepping toward Leroy. She only remembered his surprised face when he turned around, and the sudden pain in his eyes when the blade entered his chest. Leroy recoiled, grasping at the wound from which blood was already trickling out, staining his white shirt. "Imani, what are you—" He didn't finish the sentence, settling to the floor. Imani stood over him, still clutching the knife in her hand. Unable to believe what she had just done, blood dripped from the blade onto the tiled floor, forming small red puddles. Leroy stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and pain, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. Then his eyes closed and his body went limp. Imani knelt down beside him, the knife falling out of her numb fingers. She felt nothing, no remorse, no fear, no relief, only emptiness. It was an overcast early Wednesday morning. Heavy gray clouds hung over the city, portending rain. Deacon Octavius Freeman parked his car outside the Washington house at 7:30 sharp. The conversation with Imani had been on his mind all night, and thoughts of what was going on in the pastor's family kept him awake. He decided to stop by before work to make sure Imani was okay and to offer his help. Octavius rang the doorbell several times, but no one answered. This struck him as odd. Imani was usually up early. He walked around the house and peered through the kitchen window. What he saw made him recoil and clutch at his heart. On the kitchen floor lay the body of Leroy Washington in a pool of blood, and beside it sat Imani, motionless as a statue with a blank stare. With trembling hands, Octavius pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. "Emergency services, what's your emergency?" "I need the police," the deacon's voice shook, "and an ambulance. I think there's been a murder." 15 minutes later, the quiet street was filled with police cars and ambulances. Neighbors looked out of windows and gathered in small groups on the sidewalk, exchanging speculation about what had happened. News of the tragedy at the pastor's home spread with lightning speed. Detective Malik Brooks was one of the first to arrive on the scene. He recognized the address as soon as the dispatcher relayed the call. He had been at the Reverend Washington's church just a few days earlier. Strange coincidence, he thought, putting on latex gloves before entering the house. Forensics were already working inside, photographing the crime scene and collecting evidence. Leroy's body still lay on the kitchen floor, though the paramedics had already pronounced him dead. Imani sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, with a policeman who was saying something quietly to her. Her gaze was blank, as if she wasn't quite aware of what was going on around her. "Detective Brooks," Malik introduced himself, approaching the patrol officer. "What do we have here?" "Victim is Leroy Washington, 45 years old, local pastor," the officer reported. "According to the preliminary examination, death was caused by a stab wound to the chest area. The murder weapon was a kitchen knife, found near the body. The woman is his wife, Imani Washington. She was found near the body, but has not given any statement yet. She is in a state of shock." Malik nodded and turned to Imani. "Mrs. Washington," he addressed her softly. "I'm Detective Brooks. We met on Sunday at church, remember?" Imani slowly raised her eyes and looked up at him, a faint recognition flashing in her gaze. "Detective," her voice was barely audible. "Yes, I remember you." "Mrs. Washington, I need to ask you a few questions," Malik continued. "Do you feel able to speak?" Imani nodded weakly. Malik sat down next to her on the couch, pulling out a notepad. "Can you tell me what happened last night?" he asked. Imani stared straight ahead, her voice sounding monotone, emotionless. "I don't. I remember making dinner. Leroy was supposed to be back late. I went to bed early, and in the morning, I found him in the kitchen. I don't know what happened." Malik watched her carefully as she spoke. Something in her story wasn't adding up. "Did you call the police?" "No." Imani shook her head. "Yeah, I couldn't move, I just sat next to him. Then Brother Octavius showed up." "Deacon Freeman? Did he find the body?" Yes, I guess he did. I don't remember exactly. Malik made a note in his notebook. Mrs. Washington, has there been any conflict between you and your husband lately? Imani was silent for so long that Malik was already thinking of repeating the question. No, she finally said. We had a normal marriage, like everyone else's. Malik decided not to press yet. Imani was clearly in shock, and now was not the time for harsh questioning. Very well, Mrs. Washington. We'll continue this conversation later. For now, you need to get some rest. He stood up and made his way toward the CSIs who were still working in the kitchen. What do you have? He asked the chief examiner. A single stab wound, right through the heart, the man replied. The stabbing appeared to have been from the front. The victim was probably facing his attacker. Death was almost instantaneous. Any signs of a struggle? Minimal. The victim probably knew his attacker and was not expecting an attack. Malik nodded, looking around the kitchen. His gaze stopped on a cutting board with unfinished vegetables. She says she cooked dinner and then went to bed, but these vegetables look like they were cut recently. Yes, the examiner agreed. And judging from the condition of the body, death was about 10 to 12 hours ago, sometime between 8 and 10 in the evening. Malik frowned. Imani's story didn't seem so convincing anymore. Check the knife for prints, and collect blood samples from the floor and from Mrs. Washington's clothes. As they left the house, Malik spotted Deacon Octavius sitting in the police car, still pale from shock. The detective approached him. Mr. Freeman, I'm Detective Brooks. May I ask you a few questions? Octavius nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Of course, Detective. I still can't believe this happened. Tell me why you came here this morning. Octavius sighed. I was worried about Sister Imani. We had a conversation yesterday, a rather heavy one. I told her that I saw Reverend Leroy with her sister Zora. They were, they were very close, if you know what I mean. Malik raised an eyebrow. You mean that Reverend Washington had an affair with his wife's sister? I didn't mean to be so blunt about it, but yes, Octavius nodded. I happened to witness their meeting in the Reverend's office, and then saw them together one more time. I felt I had to tell Imani. She deserved to know the truth. And how did she react? She was upset, of course, but she kept her cool. Too calm now, I think so. Malik made a note in his notebook. Do you know where Zora Parker is now? No. Octavius shook his head. She's been visiting the Washingtons for the last week, but I don't know if she was here last night. Malik thanked the deacon and returned to the house. The picture of what had happened was beginning to clear, but he needed to find Zora Parker. She turned up at a motel on the outskirts of town. The receptionist confirmed that a young woman matching the description had checked in late that night with a man, but the man hadn't stayed the night. Zora opened the room door after the third knock. Her eyes were red from crying. Her hair mussed. Ms. Parker? Malik introduced himself. I'm Detective Brooks. I need to talk to you about Leroy Washington. Zora went pale. Is something wrong? I'm afraid so. Reverend Washington is dead. His body was discovered this morning. Zora staggered back and grabbed the door jamb. What? No, that's impossible. I saw him last night. He was fine. When exactly did you last see him? Around 9 p.m., Zora replied, letting the detective into the room. He drove me here and left. Said he was coming home to get some things and then he'd join me. But he didn't come back. No. Zora shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I called him, but he didn't answer. I thought maybe he had a difficult conversation with Imani and needed time. Malik watched her carefully. Ms. Parker, I need you to be completely honest with me. What was your relationship with Reverend Washington like? Zora lowered her eyes. We loved each other. It started a few months ago. We planned to be together. Did Imani know about this? She found out yesterday. Zora admitted. She saw us together in the park. When we got home, she was already waiting for us. There was a terrible conversation. She kicked us both out. But Leroy came home later? Yeah. He said he forgot his phone and wanted to pick up some things. He dropped me off here and drove back. Malik nodded, taking notes. How would you describe Mrs. Washington's condition during this conversation? Zora hesitated. She was calm, too calm. I expected screaming, hysterics, but she spoke quietly, almost monotonously. Only her eyes. There was something scary in her eyes. After talking to Zora, Malik returned to the police station, where Imani was already waiting in the interrogation room. Her condition had improved a bit. At least her gaze had become more meaningful. "Mrs. Washington," Malik began, sitting down across from her. "I spoke with your sister." Imani flinched but said nothing. "She told me about the affair between her and your husband," the detective continued, "and that you found out about it yesterday afternoon." "She's lying," Imani said quietly. "I didn't know anything." "Mrs. Washington, we have a witness, Deacon Octavius Freeman. He told us that he warned you of possible treason." Imani was silent, looking down at the table. "Analysis has shown that the knife used to kill your husband had only your fingerprints on it," Malik continued. "Blood traces matching your husband's blood type were found on your clothes that we recovered from the house." Imani raised her eyes and looked directly at the detective. "I didn't kill him." Malik sighed. "Mrs. Washington, all the evidence points to you. You had a motive. Jealousy, betrayal. You had opportunity. You were home alone. The murder weapon was found with your fingerprints on it. Why deny the obvious?" Imani was silent for so long that Malik had already thought she'd drifted off again. But then she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't remember how it happened," she said. "I remember us talking. He said he was leaving me for Zora, said there were other women before her. Then he left, but came back for his phone. We started arguing again, and he was so cold, so indifferent to my pain. Like 20 years of marriage meant nothing." Malik listened without interrupting. Imani continued after a short pause. "I was cutting vegetables for a dinner that no one ate. The knife was lying on the cutting board. I don't remember picking it up. I don't remember stabbing it. All I remember is his face, surprised, incredulous, and blood. A lot of blood." "What did you do then?" "Nothing." Imani shook her head. "I just sat next to him all night. Couldn't move, couldn't think. It was like time stopped." Malik closed the notebook. "Mrs. Washington, I am compelled to arrest you on the charge of murdering Leroy Washington." Imani nodded as if she'd expected this. "I understand. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." As Malik read out the rights, Imani looked somewhere through him, her face calm, almost peaceful, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. After the officer took Imani away, Malik was alone in the interrogation room. He stared at his notes, trying to piece together a complete picture of what had happened. The story was as old as the world: love, betrayal, revenge. And yet something about the case kept him on his toes. That evening, Malik returned to the Church of the Holy Redemption. The building was empty and quiet, with only a few candles burning at the altar. The parishioners had already begun to offer them in memory of their pastor. Malik sat down in one of the pews and thought, how could a man who had devoted his life to serving God break his vows so easily? How could a woman who had been a model pastor's wife for 20 years turn into a murderer in an instant? And where was the line between righteousness and sin if even those who seemed the most righteous could fall so low? Malik was not a particularly religious man, but his work as a detective had taught him one important truth. Human nature was much more complex than it seemed at first glance. There could be darkness behind the facade of piety, and there could be light in the most desperate sinner. He thought of Imani, of her calm acceptance of her fate. Was she a cold-blooded killer or a victim of circumstance? A criminal or a woman driven to the brink by the betrayal of those she loved most? Malik didn't know the answers to these questions. His job was to gather facts, not make moral judgments. But at this moment, sitting in an empty church, he couldn't help but think about the fine line between good and evil, about the insidiousness of sin that could penetrate even the most righteous hearts. He stood up and headed for the exit. Tomorrow he had to finish his report, hand the case over to the prosecutor, and start investigating a new crime. Life went on, even when someone's life was cut short. That was the order of things. But the story of the Washington family would haunt him for a long time to come, a reminder that no one was immune from falling. and that sometimes the worst crimes were committed not out of malice, but out of pain and despair. As he left the church, Malik cast one last glance at the altar where the Reverend Leroy Washington had stood just a few days before, preaching on faithfulness and honesty. How ironic, the detective thought, and what a lesson for all who think themselves above sin.